Hey there everyone, Mr. Lewis here, ready to wrap up with Unit 7 of AP HuG today by covering Section 6, today's agriculture. Within this section, we're going to take a look at both the consequences of all the agricultural processes we've been studying up to this point in this unit, as well as some of the challenges moving forward. One of the consequences is the growth of monoculture, meaning there are less varieties of each of the crops you see listed here in this diagram today than there were 100 years ago, and not just less varieties, but way less. Look at corn. A century ago, there were 307 different varieties of corn. Today, 12. A century ago, there were 288 varieties of beets. Dwight Schrute would have been in heaven. Today, only 17. So this is dangerous, right? Because if these varieties face some type of challenge, if there is something that wipes out one of these varieties of fruits or vegetables or any type of crop, whatever it might be, then we could be in real trouble trying to find a way to continue to meet the demand that's out there around the globe for those particular goods. So the growth of monoculturing is one example of a consequence of the agricultural practices and processes that we've been looking at throughout this unit. But there's a bunch of other stuff we need to look at too. All right, today's agriculture has a lot of economic influence. There's big money in agriculture, and as a result of that, we're seeing more and more forces at play within agricultural geography. One of those forces is the global supply chain. So because of globalization and because of the growth of international trade, we're seeing this very complex global system of supply and demand, where we may demand, for example, coffee beans in the United States to a very high degree, but coffee beans don't grow naturally and plentifully enough in the United States to meet that demand. So there are other regions in the world that are very good and very well practiced at growing coffee beans. And so this leads to this supply and demand relationship, this global supply chain within agricultural geography. Some countries become so focused on producing these goods to meet that global demand that they develop what's called a comparative advantage. They get really efficient and really effective at growing these crops compared to other countries around the world, even compared to countries whose climates are more conducive to growing those crops, right? But while that is a positive, there's also the potential to become what we call commodity dependent, where you're so focused on the expansion or the growth of one particular item that your economy becomes very dependent on that item. And therefore, if the demand for that item suddenly changes, decreases specifically, then that country might be in trouble, right? We see this not just with farm goods, but also with things like oil or other natural resources. So this is something we'll get into a little bit more in Unit 8, but this is what we call commodity dependence. Here's an example of this global supply chain at play. We have a loaf of bread here, Sara Lee, whole grain, white bread. And you can see all the different ingredients that have to go into this one loaf of bread here. Well, not all of those ingredients come from one place. Many of them you can see here stem back to the United States, and Sara Lee is a U.S. company, and that makes sense, but so many of these other ingredients have to come from other parts of the world. And so it's not just about supply and demand, it's also about the production of certain foods in general, right? The production of not just crops that are pulled right from the ground, but then what those items or what those resources go into producing next. And so one loaf of bread can have ingredients from all across the world, and then, of course, be sold all across the world, right? Cost of food is another big issue. It's not as though that loaf of bread cost the same for everybody, because in different countries, not only do things cost more or less, but also people make more or less. And the value of currency in different countries is more or less. So this diagram, this chart is showing you the average cost of ingredients for a simple bean stew as a share of daily income. And that's the important part, as a share, as a percentage of daily income. So whereas in New York, this simple bean stew would only cost 0.6% of the average daily income in New York, in South Sudan, it's 155%. It's more than double the average daily income. So food is not equally accessible or affordable for everyone around the world, or even everyone within the United States, which we'll see a little bit more about here in a second. And the main challenge here is that we have to feed a growing population around the world, right? In 1950, 1 hectare of land, which you can think of that as another way of measuring, say, like an acre or a square mile. They're not exact necessarily, but that's what we're talking about. It's a measurement of land. Well, in 1950, 1 hectare of land could feed 2 people. Okay, by 2030, it's going to have to feed 6. We have a growing population. In 1950, the world population was about 2.5 billion. By 2030, it's expected to be over 8 billion. And we only have so much arable land in the world. So each unit of land, somehow, we're going to have to figure out how to make that land feed more people. Or we have to create more arable land. Right? So we're faced with this challenge. It's a simple math problem where we have to feed the world. We're doing things to make this happen. There are all kinds of new strategies that are developing to meet the needs of this growing population, whether it's through pesticides and herbicides or genetically modified seeds that are resistant to these improved pesticides and herbicides and get better crop yields like we looked at in section 7.5, or new systems and software and processes for growing certain crops. We have to come up with new strategies, right? Develop new innovations, new technology to meet these demands of a growing global population. Again, though, there are consequences to all of this. So it's not as though we can just continue to create more farmland without any consequences, right? There's always a benefit and there's a cost, and we have to look at both sides. With some types of farming, for example, we see pollution is a big problem.